Meanwhile, the Israel-Hamas war was front and center at the UN Security Council Tuesday. Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae, spoke last hour.
We welcome the agreements that have been reached between Israel and Egypt to enable the start of crossings into Gaza. But in order to prevent a deeper catastrophe for Palestinian civilians in Gaza, we must all do more. Canada supports humanitarian pauses in order to protect civilians, to get more humanitarian assistance in, and to get foreign nationals out of Gaza.
The United States is also calling for humanitarian pauses. So what does this reveal about global opinion of this conflict? Two former Canadian ambassadors to the region join me now. Dennis Horak previously served as Canada's ambassador to Saudi Arabia and as head of Canada's mission to Iran. Jon Allen previously served as Canadian ambassador to Israel. Gentlemen, it's great to have you both back. Thanks so much for joining me. Dennis, I wonder if we could start with you. Let's start on the calls today from the U.S. and Canada for humanitarian pauses to allow aid into Gaza. Very different than the calls from ceasefire coming from countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. What does this say about where things are?
Well, I think everyone's realized that there is a humanitarian challenge in Gaza, a catastrophe really, and the need to get aid in and perhaps get hostages out and other nationals out. But there's a concern I think a lot of Western countries have, and certainly Israel has, that a ceasefire, which presumably would last a considerable amount of time, would allow Hamas to regroup and solidify their positions, get their feet under their ground, get their feet under them, and that's a risk. So it's trying to find a balance between that and the need to get humanitarian assistance in.
So John, obviously they don't want a ceasefire for the reasons Dennis has outlined there. At least that's what the Canadian government and others are saying. Does the call for humanitarian pauses tell us anything about how they feel about Israel's actions inside Gaza, or is it just a response to the humanitarian world? How do you view it?
No, I think the response of all countries is sincere. They're seeing the same pictures that your audience just saw. They know that people in the south and in the north are suffering and suffering terribly. And the minimum that the world has to do is get in food and medicine and water and hopefully fuel as is needed by the hospitals, etc. But I agree with Dennis, a ceasefire is not on because that in essence takes away what the West has argued, which is Israel's right to self-defense and to try and go in and deal with the political and military leaders of Hamas.
John, the key thing you mentioned there at the end was fuel. And we got some mixed messaging out of Israel today. The head of the IDF said they might be willing to let that in if it only went to civilians, but also one of the top advisors to Benjamin Netanyahu said there's no way they're going to let that happen because of potential diversion to Hamas. We've also heard from the health officials how badly they need fuel in the hospitals. Do you think Israel will relent on that and clear it up and allow it to go in? And could it even be policed?
I hope it will, but we've also heard that Hamas went to UNRWA's fuel reserves and took them for their own purposes. And so you can see why Israel has some concerns. But we've got to balance the humanitarian against the security concerns. And I think in this case, the hospitals need it, the desalinization plants need it, the trucks to further deliver the food. I think there's some question that they might need it as well. So I'm hoping that that will happen as well.
Dennis, there was an unusual development today. French President Emmanuel Macron was in Israel, the latest of the G7 leaders to go there. And he said his country was ready for an international coalition against ISIS, ready for the international coalition against ISIS to also fight Hamas. He was a little light on details, but how would that work? What's your sense of what Macron is proposing there?
I have no idea, to be perfectly honest. I can't imagine any coalition members, other international players going in and trying to deal with Hamas. This is an Israeli problem, and I can't imagine that Canada, France, U.S., anybody else who's involved in the ISIS coalition is going to want to deal with Hamas. I just don't understand really what he's getting at.
John, do you see it the same way?
Absolutely. France has a long history of making proposals, complex proposals, often with very little follow through. And I agree with Dennis. There's no way that anybody is going into Gaza other than Israel. You know, the leaders are inside Gaza, and that will be Israel's job alone.
Okay, so maybe no coalition there, but there is the potential for this widening, because the Pentagon said today that U.S. forces have come under attack more than a dozen times in Iraq and Syria in the past week, and some of these attacks were made by Iranian proxy groups. Now, the U.S. insists they haven't seen a direct order from Tehran to carry out these attacks, but they warned Iran today that the U.S. will defend itself. So, Dennis, what are the calculations here from Iran with words like that being spoken in Washington?
Iran has been cultivating proxies and partners all across the region: Hezbollah, Hamas, a number of groups in Syria and Iraq, to try and keep Israel at bay, to try and remind Israel that there are forward defense positions, forward defense units that Iran can use against Israel to keep them on their toes, and it's a forward defense position in some ways. Some of these groups, that's why they've spent all this money and all this time. And I don't think that Iran gives necessarily operational demands on Hezbollah or Hamas or others. Here's, you have to do X, Y, and Z right now. But the idea of sort of keeping U.S. forces at bay to remind them that, look, you can suffer some damage as well. Iran trying to demonstrate, and Iran supporting groups to demonstrate, you know, that they have capabilities as well. It's part of Iran's long-term efforts to try and spread its influence and demonstrate that it's a player that needs to be dealt with.
Jon, what's your assessment of how Iran is playing this in the past couple of weeks?
Well, you know, a lot of people have said that Hezbollah is there as a deterrent to keep Israel on its toes and not to even think about attacking Iran. And people have also said, and I agree, that it's not unlikely, but it's not clear that Iran wants to waste Hezbollah on the Palestinians. Because if Hezbollah engages in a big way, we will see a repeat of 2006. There will be bombing in South Beirut. There will be bombing in other parts of Lebanon. And the Lebanese people, who have suffered dearly in the last few years, will only suffer more. And I think Hezbollah politically and domestically has got to be very careful about avoiding that.
Dennis, if Hezbollah does get aggressive on Israel's northern border in a big way and ignores, you know, Jon's assessment of Hezbollah being wasted on Hamas, could we see strikes into Iran? Would the Israelis do that? I mean, is there the potential of it widening even beyond just the northern border and bringing Iran into this conflict?
I don't think so at this point. I mean, it depends how things spin out of control, obviously, and it's very difficult to try and predict what Tehran will do. But I think having Hezbollah try and create more difficulties for Israel on their northern border is their objective, is to make it much more complicated for Israel to just focus completely on Gaza. I don't think Israel would want to start another front, if you will, with Iran, and nor do I think Iran would want that either. It would be very complicated, very difficult for Israel to fight on all those fronts. So I don't see it happening. Plus, you could then get perhaps Iran causing problems in the Gulf, as they have in the past as well. So I think Iran is conscious about not wanting this to escalate, but on the other hand, trying to make things as difficult as possible for Israel. And I think Hezbollah has very much the same view.
Jon, just to sort of bring it back to where we started this conversation on the call for humanitarian pauses because of what we're seeing out of Gaza, and the images we just saw in Margaret Evans' pieces were jarring. The ground invasion hasn't happened yet, assuming that it will still go ahead. We're likely to see a lot more like that. What kind of a position does Israel find itself in on the cusp of a potential ground invasion and what could be weeks, if not months, of urban warfare in terms of international opinion?
Well, Israel is really between a rock and a hard place. They have had the worst massacre in their history since the Holocaust. We all know that. They have a population, even peacemakers whom I am in regular contact with, feel that Israel has to strike back, that they have to try and deal with Hamas. And yet they know, and Hamas knows, and the world knows, that going into that heavily populated urban area is inevitably going to cost human lives. Hamas knows it. They're going to continue to place themselves under hospitals and under schools, and they've got the hostages. So they're going to do everything possible to make Israel look bad. And Israel will look bad, and the world will criticize it. But as any country who just faced what Israel faced, irrespective of the history, of the root causes, of occupation, Israel feels it has to strike, and I'm pretty convinced it will.
Gentlemen, there's a lot more we could talk about, but unfortunately we're out of time, so we've got to say goodbye. But I promise we'll have you both back. We always appreciate your time. Jon Allen, Dennis Horak, thank you so much for joining me tonight.